So first thing I'm going to need is some clay and a jar. I'm going to take a little bit of the clay and cut it up into small little strips. Now the clay I'm using is a little bit dry, so I'm going to have to make it a little bit moist before I use it, because otherwise it won't stick on the jar and then later on it's more likely to crumble. So I'm going to get a little bit of water and run it over the surface and then remold it a little bit and then stick it along the jar where I want it to be. If the clay isn't too dry, it should stick straight to the glass. Now later on I'm going to stick this down with glue, but for the moment I'm just going to let the clay stick there on its own. I'm going to be using a small tool and just run it over the surface to give it a texture that looks like wood. I'm going for the look of an old Tudor cottage, so the first thing I'm going to do is create the door frame, and then I'm going to have a few beams which run alongside it. Now obviously you can do this any way you want. If you want more beams or some of them which look a little bit more elaborate, then go ahead and do that as well. But I'm going to start off with the doorway, and then once that's done I'm going to go ahead and make the door. Next I'm going to start on the door. Now I didn't have any kind of rolling pin, so I used the edge of the pen, and then I'm going to cut away the edges and then stick that where I want the door to be on the jar. If there's a little bit of a gap between the beams and the actual door that we're trying to make, then just press them together and then get a little bit of water and put that in between the cracks so that they'll stick together. You don't want these to just snap off later. And be quite generous with this, not so generous that it's completely dripping wet, but enough for there to be a little bit of a glue between the two. Next, with the sculpting tool, I'm going to draw out the beams on the door and then also the top and the bottom of the door. Now for the bottom step I want to give it a texture so that it looks more like stone and less like wood, so I'm just going to use the end of the sculpting tool and just jab that lightly into it, and I'll give it a really good texture. Now for the wood, that's quite simple. You want to take anything that's remotely pointy and then just lightly drag it over the surface, and be quite random with this. I think you'll find that the less structured you are with this, the more it looks like a grainy wood surface rather than something which looks intentionally uniform. It's not meant to look uniform. Next I'm going to be using some wall filler to plaster on the outside of the house. Now you don't have to use wall filler, you can use plaster, it's pretty much exactly the same thing. Now I'm doing this by eye, I just like to pour in stuff and mix it until the consistency is right. The problem with this is that you can end up with a bit too much or a bit too little. So if you want to, go ahead and measure some out, or deliberately make some which isn't enough and then gradually add to it as you see you need more. But I'm going to be using a little sculpting tool and just adding that in. Now for the smaller areas I'll be using a sculpting tool, but for the larger areas on the back of the jar I'm just going to be using my fingers. It's a lot faster and it just saves me time. Once I've covered everything with the plaster, I'm going to be running my fingers over it once it's dried a little bit, just to roughen up the surface a tiny bit. I don't really like the totally smooth look, it looks a little bit more authentic if it's a tiny bit roughed up. And then once the clay is dried, I'm going to go over the edges with super glue and then also the doorknob so that that doesn't fall off. Now this part's an extra really, I was kind of messing around, so you don't have to do this part at all. I just took something, I think it was from an old potpourri piece that I had lying around, and snapped it into loads of pieces, glued it on an upside down lid, and then put string around the top and super glued it. And I like to have the lids on my jars upside down so that way if I'm washing my hands or I'm having a shower I can just take my earrings off and pop them on this jar. and it's just what I personally prefer to do. And then also this lid doesn't fit this jar. And the last thing that I did was paint the beams black to make it look a little bit more authentic. And that's pretty much it. That's how to make a little Tudor house jar.